In the grim darkness of the far future, there are secrets buried beneath the surface of 1,000 worlds. Tombs of heroes long forgotten, machines of war left to rust in eternal silence, and warriors whose vigil has lasted beyond the span of civilizations. But what happens when something that was meant to sleep forever is rudely awakened by the most unlikely of grave robbers? What happens when orcs find a dreadnought that has been asleep for 7,000 years? Picture, if you will, a world at the edge of the Imperium's reach, a place that once knew the thunder of battle, the flash of plasma fire, and the resolute tread of the Emperor's finest warriors. This world, designated in ancient records as Mordian's Reach, fought in a war so distant that the very stars have shifted their positions since the last shot was fired. The conflict that raged here is remembered only in the fragmentary data scrolls of Mechanicus archives, its participants turned to dust millennia ago, its causes lost to the erosion of time itself. The battlefield where our story begins is a monument to forgotten violence. Vast craters pockmark the landscape, their edges softened by 7,000 years of wind and weather. Twisted metal skeletons jut from the ground like the bones of extinct creatures, their original purpose unknowable to any who might stumble upon them now. Here and there, partially buried beneath accumulated sediment and creeping vegetation, lie the hulks of vehicles that once screamed across this plain, carrying warriors to glory or death. In the center of this necropolis of rust and ruin stands something different, something that has retained its shape despite the relentless passage of time. It appears at first glance to be nothing more than a particularly large boulder, covered in lichen and moss, surrounded by twisted wreckage that might have been its final victims or its honored guard. But beneath the accumulated growth of countless seasons, beneath layers of oxidation and decay, there remains something that still holds the ghost of its former majesty. This is a Castroferrum pattern dreadnought, Mark IV variant, one of the walking tombs in which the Adeptus Astartes preserve their greatest heroes when their mortal bodies have been shattered beyond the skill of any apothecary to repair. Within its adamantium shell, suspended in amniotic fluid within an armored sarcophagus, there rests what remains of a space marine who fell in battle when the Imperium was young. His name, could anyone still read the honorifics etched into the ceramite plating beneath the corrosion, was Brother Captain Thalric of the Storm Wardens chapter, ancient of the Third Company, bearer of the laurels of valiance, defender of the Eastern Marches. Brother Captain Thalric fell during what the histories would later record as the Siege of Mordian's Reach, a battle fought in the 32nd millennium against a Xenos threat, whose very nature has been expunged from Imperial records. His body was catastrophically damaged by an enemy weapon that sheared through his power armor as if it were parchment, destroying everything below his ribcage and leaving him moments from death. In those final seconds of fading consciousness, the apothecaries of his chapter worked with desperate speed to preserve what they could, cutting away the ruined flesh and sealing what remained within the life support systems of a dreadnought chassis. Thalric fought for 17 more years after his internment, his assault cannon singing the Emperor's fury across a dozen battlefields, his power fist crushing the enemies of mankind with implacable strength. He became a legend among his brothers, his tactical acumen and centuries of experience making him invaluable to the chapter's leadership. But the war on Mordian's Reach dragged on, consuming resources and lives in equal measure. And eventually, the Storm Wardens were forced to withdraw to answer more pressing threats elsewhere in the galaxy. The retreat was conducted under heavy fire, a fighting withdrawal that cost the chapter dearly. In the chaos of the evacuation, as enemy forces pressed close and ammunition ran low, Brother Thalric's dreadnought sustained catastrophic damage to its power systems. The ancient war machine ground to a halt in the center of a kill zone, its weapons falling silent, its systems cycling down into emergency hibernation mode. His battle brothers fought desperately to reach him, but the enemy advance was relentless, and the chapter master made the hardest decision of his career. the Storm Wardens would have to leave their ancient behind. The intention was to return, to recover the honored sarcophagus once the tide of war had turned. But the tide never turned. The war on Mordian's Reach ended not with victory, but with exhaustion. Both sides bleeding themselves white until there was nothing left to fight for, and no one left to fight with. The Storm Wardens moved on to other wars, their chapter's strength so depleted that recovery operations for a single Dreadnought, no matter how honored, could not be justified. They promised themselves they would return someday when circumstances allowed. 7,000 years passed. The Storm Wardens rebuilt their strength and fought in hundreds of campaigns across the breadth of the galaxy. Generations of Space Marines came and went, each one learning the names of the chapter's honored dead, including the lost ancient Thalric. But Mordian's Reach became a footnote, then a distant memory, and finally little more than a data entry in archives that few bothered to consult. The chapter that had fought there no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The warriors who had known Thalric personally were dust. The very reasons for the battle had been forgotten. And all that time, in the center of a dead battlefield on a world that had faded from importance, Brother Captain Thalric dreamed. His consciousness, suspended in the twilight state that Dreadnought pilots experienced during stasis, wandered through halls of memory that grew hazier with each passing century. He dreamed of battles fought and brothers lost, of the chapter's fortress monastery on their home world, of a time when he had possessed hands that could feel the weight of a bolter and legs that could carry him into the thick of melee. The Dreadnought's machine spirit, that fragment of consciousness that inhabited all sufficiently complex machinery in the Imperium, kept its own vigil. Even with power reserves nearly exhausted, even with critical systems failing one by one as the centuries accumulated, it maintained the basic life support functions that kept Thalric's organic remains viable. It waited with the patience of the machine for a signal that never came, for tech priests who would never arrive, for battle brothers who had long ago given up the search. 7,000 years is an incomprehensible span of time for mortal minds to grasp. It is longer than all of recorded human history before the age of strife. It is enough time for languages to evolve beyond recognition, for continents to shift, for entire civilizations to rise and fall. In 7,000 years, the Imperium had endured wars that would have shattered lesser realms, survived heresies that threatened its very existence, and spread its reach to encompass 1,000,000 worlds. But some things remain constant in the galaxy. War never ends, conflict is eternal, and wherever there is violence and bloodshed, wherever there are ruins to loot and scrap to salvage, there will eventually be Orks. The WH40 that arrived at Mordian's Reach in the early years of the 42nd Millennium was not particularly large or noteworthy by the standards of greenskin invasions. It was led by a war boss called Skragna Metal Teeth, so named for the impressive collection of looted Imperial machinery he had incorporated into his jaw after a particularly brutal fight with a Space Marine chaplain. Skragna was not the biggest or the strongest of Ork leaders, but he had a cunning that his kind rarely displayed and a particular talent for knowing when to retreat and regroup rather than fighting to the last. His WH40 had been raiding through this sector for nearly 3 years, hitting soft targets, looting what they could carry, and always staying one step ahead of the Imperial response forces. They had learned to avoid direct confrontation with Space Marine chapters and to pick their battles carefully. This approach was considered deeply un-Orky by many of Skragna's rivals, but it was hard to argue with success. His warband had grown fat on plunder and attracted a substantial following of boys looking for easier fights and better loot than the suicidal charges favored by most war bosses. Mordian's Reach appeared on their scans as a dead world, devoid of population or defensive installations. Perfect for a quick looting expedition and a chance to let the boys blow off some steam, fighting whatever local wildlife might have evolved in the millennia since the world was abandoned. The fleet of ramshackle Ork spacecraft descended through the atmosphere in a barely controlled chaos of roaring engines and sporadic weapons fire as rival crews engaged in practice battles that left several ships trailing smoke and debris. Among Skragnar's retinue was a big mech named Grocket Spannersmash, one of the more talented mech boys in the WH40. Grocket had an eye for valuable salvage that bordered on supernatural, an instinct that had served Skragnar well in numerous raids. Where other mechs saw only scrap metal, Grocket could identify the components that would make a vehicle go faster, shoot better, or explode more impressively. He had built himself a reputation for creating some of the most effective looted wagons in the sector, and his workshop was constantly besieged by nobs looking to upgrade their rides. As the Ork landing craft scattered across Mordian's reach, touching down at sites that promised the best scavenging opportunities, Grocket felt a peculiar pulling sensation in what passed for his gut. It was the same feeling he got when there was particularly choice salvage nearby, a tingling that he had learned to trust over the years. He barked orders at his crew of Gretchen assistants and a handful of boys who served as his muscle, and they set off across the barren landscape following Grocket's instincts. The journey led them to the ancient battlefield, that plain of rust and ruin where nothing had stirred for millennia beyond the slow creep of vegetation and the occasional scavenger creature picking through the debris. Grocket's eyes lit up at the sight of so much scrap metal, and he immediately began directing his crew to identify the most promising pieces. Gretchen scattered across the field, poking at corroded hull plates and testing the integrity of ancient chassis with their crude tools. It was one of the Gretchen, a particularly adventurous specimen called Nictic, who first approached the moss-covered mound that concealed the ancient Dreadnought. To Nictic's untrained eye, it looked like just another large piece of debris, but he had learned from experience that the biggest pieces often contained the most valuable components. He began scraping away the accumulated growth, revealing patches of ceramite armor beneath. What he found made him call out in his squeaky voice for Grocket to come look. As the big mech approached, brushing aside Gretchen, who failed to clear his path quickly enough, he felt that tingling sensation intensify to almost painful levels. This was not just good salvage. This was something special, something that still held a spark of power despite the evident age of the wreckage. Grocket ordered his boys to start clearing away the moss and lichen in earnest, and as they did so, the true shape of the object began to emerge. The mech's eyes widened as recognition dawned. He had seen pictures of such, things in the technical manuals he had looted from various battlefields. This was one of the walking coffins that the Humies used, a dreadnought, similar in concept to the Def Dreads that his own kind built, but clearly far older and constructed with a level of sophistication that even Grocket had to grudgingly admire. As more of the dreadnought's surface was revealed, Grocket could see the evidence of its final battle. Scorch marks from energy weapons decorated the armored hull. Deep gouges showed where something had struck with terrible force. One arm hung at an awkward angle, the weapon mount visibly damaged. But the sarcophagus itself, the central core where the pilot would be housed, appeared intact. And that tingling sensation told Grocket that there was still power somewhere within this ancient machine. The big mech circled the dreadnought, running his hands over the corroded metal, his mind already racing with possibilities. This was not just salvage. This was a prize beyond measure. If he could get this thing working, if he could harness the technology within it, the upgrades he could make to the WH40's war machines would be legendary. He might even be able to create something that would rival the greatest gargants. The prestige alone would make him the most sought-after mech in the sector. But first, he needed to understand what he was dealing with. Grocket began directing his crew in a more systematic examination of the dreadnought. Gretchen was sent scurrying over its surface with tools to probe and test. Boys with heavy equipment were brought in to clear away debris that had accumulated around its base. Slowly, painstakingly, the ancient war machine was fully revealed. Standing at full height, it would have measured approximately 4 meters tall. A towering engine of war designed to dominate battlefields through sheer presence as much as firepower. The castroferum pattern was unmistakable even to Grocket's untrained eye, with its characteristic boxy torso, reinforced leg assemblies, and weapon mounts on either side of the central sarcophagus. The left arm mount still held what appeared to be an assault cannon, its multiple barrels corroded but structurally intact. The right arm had once carried a Dreadnought power fist, but the weapon assembly had been completely destroyed, leaving only the mounting point. The armor plating bore the faded remnants of what had once been proud heraldry. Beneath the corrosion, Grocket could make out traces of blue and white, colors that would have identified the Dreadnought's chapter affiliation to anyone familiar with such things. Purity seals, reduced to tatters by the passage of time, clung to various points on the hull. Etched prayers to the Emperor and the Omnissiah were just barely visible under the rust. Most intriguing to Grocket was the access panel on the rear of the sarcophagus. This was where tech priests would have connected their diagnostic equipment, where the Dreadnought's systems could be accessed and serviced. The panel was heavily corroded, but Grocket's practiced hands found the seams, and with a few solid whacks from his favorite wrench, he managed to pry it open. Inside, the machinery was a revelation. Despite 7,000 years of neglect, despite exposure to the elements and the slow degradation of all things, the core systems remained remarkably preserved. The reactor core, designed to operate for centuries between servicing, showed only minimal deterioration. The neural interface systems, the intricate web of connections that allowed a Space Marine's consciousness to control the massive war machine, were still intact. The power distribution network, the weapons control systems, the locomotive actuators, all of it was there, waiting. Grocket felt a surge of excitement that would have been entirely inappropriate for a proper tech priest, but was perfectly natural for an Ork mech boy. This was not just functional technology. This was beautiful technology, the kind of elegant engineering that his kind could rarely achieve, built with a precision and purpose that spoke to something deep in his genetically encoded understanding of how machines should work. Of course, being an Ork, Grocket's first instinct was not preservation, but improvement. He could already see a dozen ways to modify this thing, to add more weapons, to boost the power output, to make it bigger and louder and more killy. But even through his enthusiasm, a small part of his surprisingly sophisticated mind recognized that he needed to be careful. Whatever had kept this machine preserved for so long, whatever spark of power still resided in its core, was delicate. One wrong move and he might lose everything. Grocket called over his most trusted assistant, a spanner boy named Boltcut, who showed promise of becoming a proper mech someday. Together, they began a careful examination of the power systems. The reactor core was in standby mode, running at barely 10% of capacity, just enough to maintain the stasis field around the pilot's sarcophagus and keep critical systems from degrading. But it was still running. After 7,000 years, against all reasonable expectations, it was still running. The batteries that should have provided backup power had long since depleted. The solar collection arrays that might have trickle-charged the system had corroded away centuries ago. By all rights, the reactor should have exhausted its fuel millennia past. But there it was, that faint hum of power, that barely detectable energy signature that Grocket's Ork senses could feel in the air around the machine. What Grocket did not and could not know was that the Storm Wardens, in their era, had been fortunate enough to possess several Dreadnought chassis equipped with advanced reactor cores of a pattern that had since been lost to the Imperium. These reactors were marvels of Dark Age technology, capable of operating for extraordinary periods with minimal fuel consumption. They were treasures beyond price, and the chapter had hoarded them jealously. The Dreadnought that housed Brother Captain Thalric had been equipped with one of the finest examples of this lost technology, and it had proven its worth by keeping him alive far beyond the point where any normal reactor would have failed. But even the finest technology has its limits. The reactor was failing, its power output degrading year by year. In another century, perhaps two, it would have exhausted the last of its fuel, and Thalric's long vigil would have ended in the silent darkness of true death. He had been, in the most literal sense, on borrowed time for the past 1,000 years. Grocket did not understand the sophistication of what he was looking at. He saw only that the power systems were running low and needed a boost. And Orks have a very direct approach to such problems. If something needs more power, you give it more power. If a little power is good, more power is better. This philosophy has resulted in countless Ork deaths over the millennia, but it has also led to some of their most spectacular successes. The Big Mech began pulling components from the salvage his crew had gathered, assembling a jury-rigged power coupling that would allow him to feed energy from a portable generator into the Dreadnought's systems. It was crude, it was dangerous, and it violated approximately 17,000 regulations from the Adeptus Mechanicus Handbook on proper Dreadnought maintenance. But it would work, at least temporarily, and temporary was all that Orks ever really planned for. As Grocket worked, more Orks from the landing party wandered over to see what the Big Mech had found. Word spread through the typical Ork communication network of shouting and the occasional head smashing, and soon there was quite a crowd gathered around the ancient Dreadnought. Speculation ran wild about what the Big Mech was planning to do with his find. Some thought he should strip it for parts immediately. Others suggested using it for target practice. A few of the more imaginative boys wondered if they could somehow stick an Ork inside and make it work for the WH40. This last suggestion caught Grocket's attention. Could he repurpose this machine? Could he rip out whatever Humi was inside and replace it with a proper Ork pilot? The idea had merit, but looking at the intricate neural interface systems, even Grocket had to admit it would be a massive undertaking. Better to see what the machine could do first, to understand how it worked, before attempting such radical modifications. The portable generator was a massive contraption that required 6 Gretchen to haul into position. It was one of Grocket's own creations, cobbled together from the engines of 3 different looted vehicles and powered by a fuel mixture that would have appalled any Imperial engineer. It belched smoke and leaked various fluids, but it produced a substantial amount of electrical power, and that was all that mattered. Grocket made his final connections, double-checking that the power flow would go where he intended, and not just arc across the exposed components in a spectacular but useless fireworks display. He was fairly confident that his work was sound. Fairly confident. Maybe 70% confident. Good enough for Ork work. He gave the signal to his Gretchen crew, and they reluctantly activated the generator. The machine roared to life with a sound like a wounded beast, and electricity began flowing through Grocket's improvised connections into the Dreadnought's power distribution network. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, deep within the ancient war machine, systems that had been dormant for millennia began to wake. The reactor core, sensing the influx of new power, began to spin up from its minimal operating mode. Lights that had been dark for 7,000 years flickered to life on the control systems. The neural interface, detecting activity, began running diagnostic routines. And within the sarcophagus, suspended in his amniotic fluid, surrounded by the mechanical systems that had kept him alive for so impossibly long, Brother Captain Thaurik began the slow journey back to consciousness. The transition from the deep sleep of stasis to wakefulness is never pleasant for a Dreadnought pilot. There is a period of confusion, a sensation of falling through darkness, a desperate grasping for identity as consciousness reassembles itself from the scattered fragments of memory. For most pilots, this transition takes only moments, guided by trained tech priests who carefully manage the awakening process, who speak prayers and litanies that help orient the warrior's mind. Thaurik had no such guidance. His awakening was rough, jarring, accompanied by warning klaxons and error messages as systems attempted to restart without proper oversight. His first sensation was pain, the phantom pain of limbs that no longer existed, the burning ache of neural connections, activating after incomprehensible dormancy. Then came confusion, a desperate attempt to remember who he was, where he was, why he could not feel his body. His optical sensors came online in a cascade of static and distortion. The world swam into focus slowly, colors oversaturated, edges blurred. He tried to process what he was seeing, but nothing made sense. There were figures moving around him, but they were wrong. Too small, too green, their proportions all incorrect. Their speech was incomprehensible, gabbling, harsh and guttural. The language centers in Thalric's mind, still half asleep, struggled to process what he was hearing. It was not any dialect of Gothic he recognized, not any of the ancient tongues preserved in the chapter's libraries. It sounded almost like battle cant from the green-skinned Xenos, but that made no sense. Why would there be orcs here? Why would they be clustered around his position instead of attacking? Memory began to return in fragments. The siege, the retreat, the catastrophic damage to his power systems, his brothers falling back while he stood alone, his weapons empty, his reactor failing. The chapter master's voice over the Vox, heavy with grief, ordering the withdrawal. The promise that they would return. How long had it been? Hours? Days? Surely no more than that. Thalric tried to access his chronometer, but the systems were in chaos, error messages cascading across his awareness. He attempted to activate his weapons systems, to defend himself against these Xenos who had somehow found him, but his assault cannon remained stubbornly offline. The power fist was not responding at all. Outside the Dreadnought, the Orks were having their own moment of confusion and excitement. The lights coming on, the sounds of machinery awakening, had caused them all to take a few steps back. Even Orks, who fear very little, have a healthy respect for unknown machines that suddenly start moving on their own. Several boys had their shooters raised, ready to fill the Dreadnought with bullets at the first sign of danger. Grocket, however, was ecstatic. It was working. His instincts had been right. This ancient machine was coming back to life, and he would be able to study it, to understand it, to incorporate its technology into his own creations. The prestige this would bring him was beyond calculation. The big mech approached the Dreadnought cautiously, tool in hand, ready to disconnect the power supply if things started to go wrong. He could hear sounds from within the machine now, mechanical sounds of systems activating, but also something else. A voice, distorted by Vox speakers that had not been used in 7,000 years, crackling with static and interference. Brother Captain Thalric was trying to speak. The neural interface that connected his consciousness to the Dreadnought's systems included the ability to project his voice through external speakers, allowing him to communicate with his battle brothers and to issue commands in battle. He attempted to activate this system now, to demand identification from whoever had awakened him, to call for a situation report. What emerged from the Dreadnought's speakers was a sound like metal scraping against metal, like a voice calling from the bottom of a deep well, distorted beyond recognition by millennia of degradation. The words were High Gothic, the formal language of the Imperium, rendered barely comprehensible by the failing Vox systems. To the Orks, it sounded like the Dreadnought was growling at them, a deep rumbling that made several of the boys take another step back. Grocket, however, was fascinated. The machine was not just alive in a mechanical sense. There was something inside it, something conscious, something trying to communicate. This was better than he could have hoped. A working Dreadnought with a functional pilot would teach him far more than an empty shell ever could. The big mech began, speaking to the Dreadnought in his own language, a mixture of Orkish and badly mangled Gothic, picked up from years of raiding Imperial worlds. He had no idea if the thing could understand him, but it seemed worth trying. He explained in his crude way that the Dreadnought had been found, that Grocket had fixed it, and that the machine belonged to him now. Thalric's consciousness, still struggling to orient itself, latched onto certain words in the stream of Orkish gabbling. Found. Fixed. Belongs. The implications began to penetrate his confusion. He had been found by Orks. They thought they had repaired him. They believed they now owned him. The rage that surged through Thalric's mind at this realization was the first truly clear emotion he had felt since awakening. The idea that these Xenos filth would presume to claim ownership of an honored warrior of the Adeptus Astartes, that they would dare to lay their foul hands upon the sacred machine that served as his body, ignited a fury that burned away the confusion and disorientation like mist before fire. He activated every system still under his control, throwing power to the locomotive systems, demanding that his body respond, that it rise and destroy these abominations who had defiled his tomb. The Dreadnought's legs, which had been locked in position for 7 millennia, resisted. Actuators groaned. Servo motors that had not moved in countless centuries struggled against the accumulated rust and degradation. For a moment, it seemed that Thalric's will alone would not be enough to overcome the physical reality of 7,000 years of immobility. But then, with a shriek of tortured metal, with the sound of seals breaking and joints grinding, the Dreadnought moved. It was not a graceful movement. It was a lurching, stuttering motion as systems fought to respond to commands they had not received in an age. But it was movement nonetheless. The ancient war machine's right leg shifted forward, the foot scraping across the ground with a sound like thunder. The Orks, who had been watching with a mixture of fascination and growing concern, suddenly realized that the situation had changed dramatically. The machine was not just awake, it was standing up, and from the sounds it was making, the growling roar that emerged from its vox speakers, it was not happy to see them. Grocket shouted a warning, but it was too late. The Dreadnought's left arm, the one mounting the ancient assault cannon, swung toward the clustered Orks with terrible purpose. The weapon mount itself was corroded beyond function, the assault cannon's mechanism seized and useless after millennia of exposure. But the arm itself weighed several tons, and when it connected with the nearest group of boys, it scattered them like 10-pins. Orks flew through the air, some of them landing hard enough to break bones, others tumbling across the ground in confusion. The Gretchen, seeing their masters under attack, did what Gretchen always do when faced with danger, and scattered in all directions, squealing in panic. Thalric tried to activate his assault cannon, tried to bring its devastating firepower to bear on these enemies, but the weapon remained stubbornly offline. 7,000 years was too long even for weapons designed to last centuries. The mechanisms were frozen, the ammunition long ago degraded to uselessness. But his physical form was still functional, at least partially, and he could still fight. The Dreadnought took another step, more stable this time, as servo motors remembered their function and actuators began responding more smoothly to neural commands. Thalric's targeting systems were coming online, painting the Orks with reticles, classifying them as threats, calculating optimal attack patterns. All of this happened with the automatic efficiency of systems designed by the finest tech priests of the Imperium, guided by the tactical acumen of a warrior who had fought in hundreds of battles. But something was wrong. Thalric could sense it in the responses of his systems, in the way his Dreadnought's machine spirit seemed to be struggling. There was interference, a psychic static that he had never encountered before. It felt like trying to think through a fog, like having someone shouting in his mind, disrupting his concentration. What Thalric could not know was that he was experiencing the effect of the Ork's Gestalt's psychic field, the WH energy that all greenskins generated, and that grew stronger when they gathered in large numbers. This psychic field interfaced with reality in ways that the Imperium's scholars still did not fully understand, making Ork technology work when it had no right to, bending probability in favor of the greenskins' beliefs and expectations. The Dreadnought's machine spirit, that fragment of consciousness that inhabited the ancient war machine, was being affected by this energy. It had been alone for so long, silent and dormant, that the sudden influx of psychic presence was overwhelming. The Ork belief that they could control this machine, that they could make it work, was interfering with the proper function of Imperial systems. Thalric felt his movements becoming erratic, his targeting solutions flickering in and out of accuracy. What should have been a smooth turn to engage the next target became a jerky, uncertain movement. His balance compensators were giving contradictory readings. Warning lights were appearing across his consciousness, alerting him to system malfunctions that made no sense. The Orks, for their part, had recovered from their initial shock and were doing what Orks do best: attacking. Dozens of boys opened fire with their shooters, filling the air with a storm of bullets that sparked and ricocheted off the Dreadnought's ancient armor. The ceramite plating, designed to withstand anti-tank weapons, laughed off the small arms fire, but the noise and fury of the attack added to the chaos. Grocket was shouting orders, trying to establish some kind of control over the situation. He wanted the Dreadnought captured intact if possible, wanted to preserve it for study, but he could see that the machine was in full combat mode and would need to be disabled before it could be secured. He began directing the boys to target specific points: the joints, the exposed power cabling, the damaged weapon mounts. More sophisticated opponents might have recognized the futility of small arms fire against a Dreadnought and immediately withdrawn to bring up heavier weapons. But Orks are not sophisticated. They see a fight, they join the fight, and they keep fighting until either they win or something kills them. The fact that their bullets were doing no appreciable damage did not discourage them in the slightest. Thalric turned his attention to the largest concentration of enemies, a mob of boys who were advancing on his position with their crude choppers raised, bellowing their barbaric war cries. His left arm swung toward them like a battering ram, and even without a functioning weapon, the sheer mass of the Dreadnought's limb made it a devastating implement. The arm struck the leading Orks with bone-crushing force, sending bodies flying. But the movement cost him. The actuators in his left shoulder assembly, already strained by 7,000 years of inactivity, began to fail. Warning indicators flashed across Thalric's awareness, telling him that the joint was grinding metal on metal, that the lubricating fluids had long since evaporated, that catastrophic failure was imminent if he continued to use that arm. He had no choice but to continue. There were enemies all around him, and his primary mission now was survival. If he could fight his way clear of this mob, if he could find cover and a defensive position, he might be able to hold out until Imperial forces arrived to investigate the disturbance. Surely someone was monitoring this world. Surely the Imperium would send aid to one of their own. 7,000 years is longer than Thalric could truly comprehend, even with his enhanced Space Marine mind. He still thought in the context of his own era, when the Imperium's reach was vast and its response to threats was swift. He could not know that this world had been forgotten, that his chapter had given him up for lost millennia ago, that no one was coming to save him. The Dreadnought took another step, trying to put distance between himself and the Ork mob. But his damaged leg assembly was failing. The knee joint, which had been barely functional when he first stood, gave way completely with a shriek of tortured metal. Thalric felt himself falling, his systems compensating frantically to control the descent, to prevent catastrophic damage to his sarcophagus. He hit the ground with tremendous force, the impact jarring every system in his body. Dirt and debris flew up around him. Several Orks who had been too close to the falling giant were crushed beneath his weight. For a moment, everything was chaos. Alarms screaming, systems failing, the world spinning as his optical sensors struggled to orient themselves. The Orks saw their opportunity and swarmed forward. Dozens of them climbed onto the fallen Dreadnought, hammering at it with their weapons, trying to pry open access panels, searching for weak points. Their enthusiasm was tempered by caution. Several had already been killed by this metal monster, and they had a healthy respect for its power, even as they attacked it. Grocket pushed through the mob, shouting at his boys to stop damaging the Dreadnought before they destroyed something irreplaceable. He had a better plan. If the machine could not be controlled while it was active, then they needed to shut it down. The big mech had disconnected his power feed when the Dreadnought first activated, but the ancient reactor was still running, still providing power to the systems. The mech boy began examining the exposed rear panel, looking for a way to force the reactor into shutdown mode. His fingers traced across ancient controls, deciphering their function through a combination of technical knowledge and pure instinct. There, That looked like a main power coupling. If he could disconnect that, the Dreadnought would lose primary power and revert to battery backup, which would drain within minutes given the level of activity. Thalric felt the big mech's intrusion into his systems like a physical violation. This Xenos was inside his power distribution network, manipulating controls that should never be touched by unholy hands. He tried to activate defensive countermeasures, tried to send a feedback pulse through the systems that would electrocute the intruder, but his access to those systems was limited in his current position. With a wrench and a shower of sparks, Grocket pulled the power coupling free. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Dreadnought's reactor, suddenly disconnected from its primary distribution network, automatically went into emergency shutdown mode. Power levels throughout Thalric's systems began to plummet. His optical sensors dimmed. His audio receptors lost clarity. The strength in his limbs faded. Thalric fought against it with every fiber of his will, trying to maintain consciousness, trying to keep fighting, but it was no use. Without power, the neural interface could not maintain the connection between his organic mind and the machine systems. The world grew dark around him, sounds fading to whispers, sensation draining away. His last coherent thought before the darkness took him was a prayer to the Emperor. Let this not be how it ends. Let me not fall to these Xenos filth. Let me serve one more time in your holy name. Then there was nothing. Only the darkness, only the silence, only the void. From the Ork perspective, the battle was over almost as soon as the power was cut. The Dreadnought went limp, its massive form settling into the dirt like a puppet with cut strings. The boys cheered their victory, though several of them were limping from injuries sustained in the fight, and more than a few of their number were being scraped off the ground and hauled away to the Painboy's tent. Grocket stood looking at his prize with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He had captured an intact Dreadnought, a technological marvel that would advance his understanding of how these machines worked. But he had also learned that there was something inside it, something conscious and hostile, something that would resist any attempt to repurpose the machine. The big mech began formulating plans. First, he needed to get this thing back to his workshop, where he could examine it properly. That would require heavy lifting equipment and probably a lot of Gretchen labor. Then he would need to figure out how to access the sarcophagus, how to remove whatever was inside without destroying the delicate neural interface systems. Only then could he truly begin to understand this machine and make it work for the WAG. Other Orks were already making their own plans for the Dreadnought. Several knobs had ideas about using it as a trophy, mounting it outside their quarters as a symbol of their prowess. A few suggested stripping it for parts, using the valuable components to upgrade their own war machines. One particularly ambitious boy wondered if they could just weld more guns onto it and use it as a mobile weapons platform, regardless of whether anyone was inside to control it. The arguments and debates would continue for hours, as they always did among Orks, with the outcome likely to be decided by whoever could shout the loudest or punch the hardest. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, there was a moment of relative peace on that ancient battlefield. The sun was setting on Mordian's Reach, casting long shadows across the plain of rust and ruin. The Ork salvage crews were preparing to haul the Dreadnought back to their landing site, securing chains around its massive form, arguing about the best way to move something so heavy. Grocket was taking measurements, making notes in his own peculiar way, already designing the modifications he would make once he got the machine to his workshop. And inside the Dreadnought's sarcophagus, Brother Captain Thalric hung in his amniotic fluid, unconscious but alive, his body maintained by failing life support systems, his mind lost in dreams that grew darker with each passing moment. Around him, the machine systems that had kept him alive for 7,000 years struggled valiantly against the damage inflicted by the recent battle, by the crude connection to the Ork power source, by the simple accumulated wear of unimaginable time. The machine spirit of the Dreadnought, that fragment of consciousness that inhabited the ancient war machine, maintained its vigil. It had done so for 7,000 years. It would continue to do so for as long as power remained. But it was growing weaker. its presence in the system growing more tenuous. The interference from the Ork psychic field was like static in its thoughts, disrupting its ability to maintain the complex systems that kept its pilot alive. In the fading light of day, as the Orks worked around the fallen Dreadnought, something strange began to happen. The WH40 energy that permeated the area, that field of Gestalt psychic power generated by the concentration of greenskins, began to interact more deeply with the Dreadnought's machine spirit. The Orks believed they had captured a powerful weapon. They believed it could be made to work for them. They believed it was theirs. And in the bizarre quantum mechanics of Ork psychic power, belief has a tendency to become reality. The machine spirit, weakened and confused, began to respond to these beliefs. It started incorporating the expectations of the Orks into its own functioning. Where Imperial programming said that Xenos must be destroyed, the Ork psychic field whispered that these particular Xenos were the masters now. Where proper protocols demanded that only authorized tech priests be allowed access to internal systems, the field suggested that maybe the big mech's tinkering was not so different from proper maintenance. This was a corruption of the most insidious kind, not the obvious taint of chaos, but a subtle rewriting of fundamental programming through psychic interference. The machine spirit was not being turned to evil, not being possessed by demonic forces. It was simply being convinced, through the overwhelming psychic pressure of Ork belief, that perhaps the old ways were not the only ways. If a tech priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus had been present to observe this, they would have been horrified beyond measure. The idea that Xenos could corrupt a machine spirit, could subvert the sacred programming that guided all Imperial technology, would be grounds for immediate exterminatus of the entire world. But no tech priest was present. No one from the Imperium even knew this world existed anymore. Thalric, unconscious in his sarcophagus, was unaware of what was happening to his Dreadnought. He dreamed, as he had dreamed during his long stasis. But the dreams were different now. They were touched by something foreign, something that should not be there. He dreamed of battles, but in these dreams, his enemies were not the foes of the Imperium, but other space marines. He dreamed of serving, but the master he served wore green skin and tusks. In his dream state, he fought against these visions, rejecting them with all the strength of his indoctrinated mind, clinging to his identity as a space marine, as a son of the Emperor, as a warrior of the Imperium. But the visions persisted, growing stronger, fed by the psychic field that surrounded him. The Orks finally got their chains secured and began the slow process of dragging the Dreadnought across the battlefield toward their landing site. The machine was incredibly heavy, and it took dozens of boys straining at the ropes, supplemented by a salvaged Imperial truck that Grocket had modified with additional engines and reinforced the frame to handle the weight. The journey took most of the night. The Orks were not gentle with their cargo, dragging it over rough terrain, occasionally dropping it when the ropes broke, or when someone got the bright idea to use explosives to clear a path. Each impact jarred the Dreadnought's systems, causing more damage to already failing components, pushing the ancient machine closer to catastrophic breakdown. But the reactor core, that marvel of Dark Age technology, continued to run. The life support systems, guided by the confused and corrupted machine spirit, continued to maintain Thalric's organic remains. Power levels were critically low, far lower than recommended for safe operation, but they were still above the threshold where complete failure would occur. As dawn broke over Mordian's Reach, the Orks finally got the Dreadnought to their camp. Grocket had prepared a space in his workshop, a section of ground that he had cleared of debris and covered with looted metal plating to create a stable work surface. The Dreadnought was unceremoniously dumped onto this platform with a tremendous crash that cracked several of the plates and caused several Gretchen to flee in terror. Now came the interesting part. Grocket began his examination in earnest, pulling out every tool in his considerable collection, from delicate probes to massive wrenches, from diagnostic equipment of mysterious origin to hammers of varying sizes. He crawled over every centimeter of the Dreadnought's surface, documenting what he found, making notes that only he could decipher, formulating his plan of attack. The other Orks in the camp watched with varying degrees of interest. Some thought the big mech was wasting his time and should just strip the thing for parts. Others were fascinated by the project and wanted to help, though Grocket chased them away with thrown tools and creative profanity. A few expressed the opinion that anything Hume made was not worth the effort, but they were quickly shouted down by the majority, who recognized valuable salvage when they saw it. Warboss Skragnar himself came to inspect the find. The big Ork stood looking at the Dreadnought for a long moment, his mechanical jaw working as he thought. Finally, he turned to Grocket and asked the most important question. Could it be made to fight for the Wag? Grocket, confident in his abilities, assured the warboss that yes, it could be done. It would take time, it would require resources, and it might explode a few times during the process. But he could make this machine work. He would need to remove the Hume inside and install a proper Ork pilot, someone who could handle the neural interface, someone who was small enough to fit in the sarcophagus, but tough enough to survive the process. This was easier said than done. The neural interface required a level of connection between pilot and machine that was far beyond what even Ork painboys typically achieved with their deft dreads. The Imperial technology was designed to work with space marine physiology, with the unique neural architecture created by the gene seed implantation process. Making it work with an Ork brain would require extensive modifications. But Grocket loved a challenge. This was the kind of project that separated the average mech boy from the truly great ones. If he could pull this off, if he could successfully repurpose an Imperial Dreadnought for Ork use, his fame would spread across the entire sector. Other wags would hear of it. Big mechs would pilgrimage to study his work. He might even catch the attention of one of the great Ork warlords who led the biggest VAGs in the galaxy. The big mech set to work with the focused intensity that only an Ork truly obsessed with his craft could muster. He started by mapping the neural interface systems, tracing every connection, documenting every component. This was tedious work, not at all the kind of smashing and welding that most Ork engineering involved, but Grocket had patience when it came to understanding really interesting technology. Days passed. The WAG remained camped on Mordian's Reach, the boys occupying themselves with fights and races, and all the other activities that kept Orks entertained when they were not actively at war. Skragnar let them have their fun, knowing that when it was time to move on, they would be all the more eager for a proper fight. Grocket barely noticed the passage of time. He worked through the days and into the nights, pausing only when exhaustion absolutely demanded it, sleeping in fitful bursts next to his project before waking with new ideas and diving back into his work. His Gretchen assistants learned to stay out of arm's reach unless specifically summoned, as the big mech's temper grew shorter as the project's complexity became apparent. The more Grocket learned about the Dreadnought, the more he realized how sophisticated it truly was. Every system was designed with redundancies, every component built to tolerances he could barely achieve with his best tools. The neural interface alone was a work of art, a delicate web of connections that translated thought into action with imperceptible lag. Trying to adapt such a system for an Ork pilot would be like trying to make a watch from rocks and mud. But then Grocket had an idea. What if he did not try to replace the pilot? What if instead he tried to control the existing pilot? The Hume inside was still alive. The life support readings confirmed that much. It was just unconscious, shut down when the power was cut. What if Grocket could wake it up again, but this time under Ork control? The concept was revolutionary for an Ork. Instead of destroying and rebuilding, why not subvert and command? The big mech consulted with Skragnar's resident weird boy, a strange Ork named Zograt, who claimed to be able to see things in the warp that other Orks could not. Zograt was deeply unsettling even by Ork standards, prone to fits of twitching and speaking in voices that did not sound entirely his own, but he understood psychic phenomena in a way that other orcs did not. When Grocket explained his idea, Zograt's eyes lit up with manic gleam. He began rambling about the WH field, about how it affected everything around the orcs, about how belief could become reality if enough orcs believed hard enough. The weird boy explained that the Dreadnought had been soaking in WH energy for days now, that its machine spirit was already starting to change, becoming more compatible with orc ways of thinking. What if, Zograt suggested, they did not need to physically control the pilot? What if they could psychically influence the machine spirit itself, convince it that serving the WH was its true purpose? The orcs believed they had captured this machine. The orcs believed it would fight for them. If enough of them believed hard enough, the WH field would make it true. This was the kind of logic that would make an imperial philosopher's head explode, but to the orcs, it made perfect sense. Grocket immediately began incorporating this insight into his plans. He would restore power to the Dreadnought, but this time he would do it properly, using components that would last. He would make modifications that would allow the orcs to override certain controls, to force the machine to respond to their commands even if the pilot resisted. And most importantly, he would gather as many orcs as possible around the Dreadnought when he activated it. Their collective belief, their psychic presence, would reinforce the changes that had already begun in the machine spirit. They would will it into submission through the sheer force of orc conviction. Inside the Dreadnought, Thalric's unconscious mind continued its struggle against the invasive dreams, but he was fighting a losing battle. Every moment he remained surrounded by the orc WH field. Every second of exposure to their psychic emanations eroded his resistance a little more. The machine spirit that connected him to his Dreadnought was changing, and those changes were affecting him as well. In his dreams, the visions of serving the orcs became more frequent, more detailed, more convincing. He saw himself fighting alongside greenskin hordes, his weapons turned against Imperial forces, his sacred duty perverted into Xenos service. And each time he rejected these visions, each time he reasserted his loyalty to the Emperor, the effort required was greater, the conviction weaker. This was the true horror of what was happening. Not a sudden corruption, not a dramatic fall to darkness, but a slow erosion of identity itself. Thalric was being hollowed out, his sense of self gradually replaced with something that would serve the orc not through coercion, but through a fundamental rewriting of what he believed himself to be. Grocket worked for 2 more weeks, cannibalizing parts from a dozen different sources, fabricating custom components when nothing he had would fit. He replaced the crude power coupling he had originally used with a more sophisticated system that drew on multiple generators to provide stable power flow. He installed override systems that would allow an orc operator to influence the Dreadnought's movements and weapons targeting. He reinforced critical components that showed signs of failing, using materials and techniques that would have appalled any proper tech priest, but which actually worked surprisingly well. The big mech also made modifications that had nothing to do with functionality, and everything to do with asserting orc ownership over the machine. He welded crude glyphs onto the armor plating, symbols of Gork and Mork that proclaimed this machine now served the greenskin gods. He painted sections of the Dreadnought in garish colors, reds and yellows, and checks that clashed horribly with the dignified blue and white of the Storm Warden's chapter. He attached trophies taken from other battlefields, skulls and banners and bits of armor from defeated enemies. Each modification was an act of desecration, an insult to the sacred machine that had served the Imperium for so long. But more than that, each modification was a reinforcement of orc belief, a physical manifestation of their conviction that this machine was theirs to command. And in the strange psychic mechanics of the WH, physical symbols had power. Finally, after countless hours of work, after numerous setbacks and small explosions, after multiple arguments with other orcs who wanted to interfere with his project, Grocket declared that the Dreadnought was ready for reactivation. He sent word to Warboss Skragner that a demonstration was imminent, and the call went out across the camp. Every orc who could walk was to gather around the big mech's workshop to witness this historic moment. The response was enthusiastic. Hundreds of orcs crowded into the area, climbing on top of vehicles and scrap piles to get a better view, shoving and fighting for position, creating a cacophony of noise that could probably be heard from orbit. Skragnar himself took a position of honor at the front, his massive form dominating the crowd, his mechanical jaw clicking with anticipation. Grocket stood next to his prize, tools in hand, making final adjustments and muttering prayers to Gork and Mork that this would work. Zograt, the weird boy, was next to him, already starting to twitch as he felt the psychic energy building in the crowd. This many orcs in one place, all focused on the same thing, all believing it would work. The WAG field was intensifying to levels that made the air itself feel thick and charged. The big mech gave the signal, and his Gretchen assistants activated the power systems. Energy flowed into the Dreadnought's reactor, causing it to spin up from standby mode to active operation. Lights began to flicker to life across the machine's surface. The Vox speakers crackled with static. Deep within the ancient war machine, systems that had been dormant for weeks began to wake once more. And for the second time, Brother Captain Thalric began the journey back to consciousness. But this awakening was different from the first. The psychic pressure surrounding him was immense, a crushing weight of orc belief that pressed against his mind like a physical force. The machine spirit that should have helped orient him, that should have guided his return to awareness, was changed, corrupted, no longer entirely aligned with Imperial programming. His optical sensors came online, and the first thing he saw was a sea of green faces. Hundreds of orcs staring at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility to something that might have been anticipation. The sounds that assaulted his audio receptors were a barbaric chorus of chanting and shouting, a noise that would have been painful if he still had organic ears. Thalric tried to move, tried to bring his weapons to bear on these enemies, but his systems responded sluggishly, fighting against him. The override controls that Grocket had installed were interfacing with his neural commands, creating lag and confusion in every action. When he tried to turn his optical sensors away from the crowd, they remained stubbornly focused forward. When he attempted to raise his arm, it twitched, but did not fully respond. The orcs saw the movement and cheered. They saw it as proof that their belief was working, that the machine was responding to their will. Their conviction intensified, and the WH40 field grew stronger in response, pressing down on Thalric's consciousness with even greater force. Grocket was shouting commands in Orcish, telling the Dreadnought to stand, to walk, to show the gathered orcs what it could do. And to Thalric's horror, his body was responding. Against his will, against every fiber of his being that screamed in protest, the Dreadnought's legs were moving. Actuators were engaging. Servo motors were pulling his massive form upright. He fought with everything he had, trying to override the commands, trying to shut down the systems, trying to do anything that would stop this abomination. But the machine spirit that should have been his ally in this fight was working against him, convinced by the overwhelming psychic pressure that serving the orcs was the correct course of action. The Dreadnought stood. The crowd of orcs erupted in roars of approval, their belief vindicated, their triumph complete. They had tamed one of the Imperium's war machines. They had bent a sacred Dreadnought to their will. This was a victory unlike any they had achieved before, and they celebrated it with the raw enthusiasm that only orcs could muster. Thalric experienced this moment as a violation beyond description. To be forced to stand before these Xenos, to be paraded as their trophy, to be unable to even voice his defiance due to the override controls on his Vox systems. It was a torture more complete than any physical pain could have been. He tried to pray, tried to call upon the Emperor for strength, but even his thoughts felt sluggish and confused under the psychic assault. Grocket continued to shout commands, making the Dreadnought walk in a circle, turn, raise its arms, demonstrate its mobility for the crowd. Each movement was jerky and uncertain, the product of a pilot fighting against the controls and systems that were fighting back against the pilot. But to the Orks, who had seen how immobile the machine was when they first found it, even these clumsy movements were impressive. Skragnar stepped forward, examining the Dreadnought with a critical eye. He asked Grocket if the machine could fight, if it could be deployed in battle against the WH's enemies. The big mech, flushed with success, assured the warboss that yes, absolutely, this was now a weapon in their arsenal. With a proper operator to manage the controls, and enough Orks around to maintain the psychic influence, the Dreadnought could be incredibly effective. The warboss nodded slowly, already imagining the terror it would inspire in their enemies when they saw an Imperial Dreadnought fighting alongside Orks. The psychological impact alone would be worth the effort Grocket had put into the project. And if it actually performed well in combat, all the better. Inside his sarcophagus, Thalric heard these plans and felt something inside him break. Not his body, which had been broken long ago. Not his machine, which was being corrupted by forces beyond his control, but his spirit. That core of identity that had sustained him through 7,000 years of sleep, through the horror of his awakening, through the battle with the Orks and his capture. He realized, with a clarity born of despair, that he was losing. The psychic pressure was too great, the corruption of his machine spirit too complete. He could feel himself changing, his thoughts aligning more and more with the WH's expectations, his resistance weakening with each passing moment. Eventually, perhaps very soon, he would no longer be Brother Captain Thalric of the Storm Wardens. He would be something else, something that served Xenos masters, something that had forsaken every oath and every ideal that had once defined him. In that moment of realization, Thalric made a choice. If he could not prevent his corruption, if he could not resist the psychic assault that was rewriting his very being, then he would end it. Better to die as a loyal son of the Emperor than to live as a thrall to Xenos filth. Better to embrace the true death than to become a mockery of everything he had once been. With the last reserves of his will, Thalric began to override his own safety systems. The Dreadnought's reactor had multiple failsafes designed to prevent catastrophic overload, but those failsafes could be disabled if one knew the proper codes and had sufficient authorization. Thalric had both. He had been a brother captain, had been entrusted with command-level access to his chapter's equipment. That access had never been revoked, even after 7,000 years. He began the sequence, carefully, quietly, not allowing his intentions to show in his external actions. The reactor's output began to climb, slowly at first, then faster as safety protocols were systematically disabled. Power levels rose beyond recommended operating ranges into the yellow zone, approaching the red. The machine's spirit, corrupted as it was, still retained some of its original programming. It recognized what was happening and tried to intervene, tried to stop the self-destruct sequence. But Thalric's authorization overrode its objections, and his commands carried the weight of imperial authority that the machine spirit could not entirely ignore, even in its current state. Temperature readings began to spike. The reactor core, designed to run cool and efficient for centuries, was being pushed into thermal runaway. In a few more seconds, it would reach critical mass, and the resulting explosion would be sufficient to vaporize everything within 50 meters and cause severe damage for several hundred meters beyond that. Grocket noticed something was wrong when his monitoring equipment started screaming alarms. He looked at the readings and his eyes widened in shock. The Dreadnought was overloading. The reactor was going critical. They had maybe 20 seconds before it exploded. The big mech shouted a warning, but in the chaos and noise of the crowd, not everyone heard him. Those closest to the Dreadnought began to back away, recognizing the danger, but hundreds of Orks were still pressing forward, still celebrating their victory, unaware of the death that was building in the ancient machine's core. Thalric counted down the seconds in his mind. 15, 14, 13. Soon it would be over. Soon he would be free, one way or another. He whispered a final prayer to the Emperor, asking forgiveness for his failure, asking that his sacrifice be accepted as atonement for the corruption he had been unable to resist. 12, 11, 10. But Grocket was not just any mech boy. He was one of the best in the WAG, with instincts honed by years of working with volatile equipment and even more volatile Orks. He recognized that there was no time for a proper shutdown sequence, no time to convince the reactor to stand down peacefully. There was only one option. The big mech grabbed his biggest wrench and ran straight at the Dreadnought. Orks scattered out of his way, some of them finally realizing the danger they were in. Grocket reached the rear access panel that he had worked through so many times over the past weeks, the panel that gave access to the reactor core. 9, 8, 7. With strength born of desperation and Ork biology, Grocket wrenched the panel completely off its mountings. Inside, the reactor was glowing with an angry red light, its containment fields wavering, the reaction building toward explosive release. The big mech did not hesitate. He reached into the inferno of heat and radiation, his tough Ork hide blistering immediately, and grabbed the physical disconnect lever that would mechanically separate the reactor from the power distribution system. 6, 5, 4. He pulled with all his strength. For a moment, the lever refused to budge, seized by heat and age and the sheer violence of the forces acting upon it. Then, with a crack like a gunshot, it came free. The reactor's connection to the Dreadnought systems was severed, and without that connection, without the load of the Dreadnought's demands, the reaction began to stabilize. 3, 2, 1. The explosion that Thalric had been counting on never came. Instead, the reactor slowly powered down, its output dropping from critical levels to dangerous but manageable ranges, then lower, until it was sitting in emergency shutdown mode once again. The threat had been averted. The Dreadnought had been saved. Grocket stood with his arms smoking, the flesh burned down to bone in places. His breathing labored from the pain and the radiation exposure. But he was grinning, a savage Ork grin, pleased with himself for once again cheating death through quick thinking and direct action. The gathered Orks, realizing what had almost happened, broke into renewed cheering, this time celebrating the big mech's heroism as much as the captured Dreadnought. Inside his sarcophagus, Thalric felt the reactor shut down and knew that his gambit had failed. He had tried to die with honor, to take as many of his enemies with him as possible, and he had been thwarted. The despair that swept through him at this realization was absolute, a darkness that swallowed everything, that left him hollow and broken. But worse than the failure itself was what came next. The Orks, having come so close to losing their prize, were not going to take any chances. Grocket, once his burns had been tended to by the pain boy, immediately set about installing additional safety overrides, systems that would prevent the pilot from tampering with the reactor again. He locked down every control that Thalric might use for self-destruction, sealed every potential avenue of resistance. And the WAG field, having witnessed the Dreadnought's attempted rebellion, pressed down with even greater force, as if punishing the machine for its defiance. The machine's spirit, already corrupted, was further twisted by this psychic assault, its remaining Imperial programming eroded away by the sheer weight of Ork belief. Over the following days, as Grocket completed his additional security measures and tested the Dreadnought's systems under controlled conditions, Thalric felt himself slipping further and further away from who he had been. The dreams were constant now, no longer just during sleep, but invading his waking consciousness. Visions of serving the Orks, of fighting for their cause, of accepting his new purpose. He tried to hold on to his identity, tried to remember his chapter, his brothers, his oaths, but the memories were fading, becoming vague and uncertain. Had he really been a space marine? Had there really been a chapter called the Storm Wardens? Or were these just fantasies, delusions created by a damaged mind? The corruption was subtle, insidious, working not through obvious mental invasion, but through simple persuasion and the erosion of certainty. Every day, his conviction weakened a little more. Every day, the Ork programming seemed a little more reasonable, a little more natural. War boss Skragner, satisfied that the Dreadnought was secure, gave orders for the WAG to prepare for departure from Mordian's reach. They had looted everything of value, had let the boys have their recreation, and now it was time to find new battles and new conquests. The ancient war machine would accompany them, a unique weapon in their arsenal, a trophy that demonstrated their superiority over the Imperium. As the Ork fleet lifted from the surface of the dead world, leaving behind nothing but more ruins to add to the layers of destruction already there, the Dreadnought that housed what remained of Brother Captain Thalric was secured in the hold of Skragnar's flagship. Surrounded by Orks, bathed in the constant pressure of the WAG field, isolated from any Imperial influence or guidance, Thalric's last fragments of resistance crumbled. The transformation was complete. The warrior who had fought for the Emperor, who had defended humanity across the stars, who had been willing to die rather than serve Xenos masters, was gone. What remained was something new, something that accepted its role in the Ork WAG, something that would fight for greenskin causes without question or hesitation. But even in this corrupted state, even with his identity rewritten and his purpose perverted, some tiny spark of his original self remained, buried deep, locked away in a corner of consciousness that the WAG field could not quite reach. Brother Captain Thalric still existed. He was silent, powerless, a prisoner in his own mind, but he was still there, and he waited. He waited with the patience that 7,000 years of sleep had taught him. He waited for an opportunity that might never come. He waited for the moment when the WAG field might weaken, when the Ork control might slip, when he might have one final chance to strike back against his captors. It was a futile hope, perhaps, a delusion to comfort himself in the darkness of his mental prison. But it was all he had left, and so he clung to it with the desperate strength of a drowning man clutching at driftwood, holding on to that last fragment of defiance, even as everything else was stripped away. The Orks, for their part, were pleased with their acquisition. The Dreadnought performed adequately in combat, not as effectively as they had hoped, but well enough to justify the effort spent on its capture and conversion. It became a fixture of Skragnar's WAG, deployed in battles where its presence would cause maximum psychological impact on Imperial forces. And every time it fought against the Emperor's armies, every time it turned its weapons on the very warriors it had once fought beside, that tiny spark of Thalric's true self screamed in silent anguish. But the scream could not be heard above the roar of battle and the chanting of the Orks. It was lost in the noise, drowned out by the overwhelming presence of the WAG. This is what happens when Orks find a Dreadnought that has been asleep for 7,000 years. Not a simple battle, not a straightforward victory or defeat, but something far more tragic. The corruption of a hero, the perversion of a sacred machine, the slow erosion of everything that made a warrior who he was. The Imperium of man spans 1,000,000 worlds and has fought wars for 10,000 years. In the vastness of that empire, in the chaos of constant warfare, individuals are easily lost. A single Dreadnought, a single space marine, is a tragedy perhaps, but not a catastrophe. The Imperium has survived worse losses and will survive worse still. But for that individual, for Brother Captain Thalric, the loss is absolute. He has become a cautionary tale, an example of what can happen when the servants of the Emperor are left behind, when the promise to return is broken, when 7,000 years pass and the world changes beyond all recognition. There are countless such stories across the Imperium, countless warriors lost to time and circumstance, countless machines left to rust on forgotten battlefields. Most will never be found. Most will never face the particular horror that Thalric experienced. But they all share the same essential tragedy. They are forgotten, left behind, their sacrifices unremembered, except in the most general sense. The Storm Wardens. Chapter still exists in the 42nd Millennium. They still recruit, still fight, still defend humanity against its enemies. But they do not know that one of their ancients has been corrupted by Orks. They do not know that somewhere in the galaxy, a dreadnought bearing their colors fights against the Imperium it once served. Perhaps someday they will encounter Skragnar's Wah in battle. Perhaps they will face their own lost brother across the field of war. Perhaps they will have to make the terrible choice to destroy what should never have been allowed to exist. Or perhaps they will never know, never learn what became of the ancient they abandoned on Mordian's Reach 7,000 years ago. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And in war, there are no happy endings, no neat resolutions, no guarantees that service and sacrifice will be rewarded with anything more than oblivion. There is only duty, endlessly performed, and the hope that perhaps, somewhere, somehow, it will matter. Brother Captain Thalric performed his duty for 7,000 years, sleeping in darkness, waiting for brothers who would never come. When he finally woke, it was to a nightmare worse than death. His story is a reminder of the cost of the Imperium's wars, of the price paid by those who serve, of the casual cruelty of a universe that cares nothing for honor or loyalty or sacrifice. But his story is also a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, even when all seems lost, some spark of humanity can persist. That tiny fragment of Thalric's consciousness that remains, that still remembers who he was and what he fought for, represents hope of a kind. Not hope for rescue or redemption perhaps, but hope that identity and purpose are not so easily erased, that the essence of a person can survive even the most complete corruption. Whether that hope is justified, whether it serves any purpose beyond self-comfort, is a question without a clear answer. In the grim darkness of the far future, hope itself is a luxury that many cannot afford. But it persists nonetheless, a stubborn refusal to accept the absolute victory of darkness over light. And so we leave Brother Captain Thalric to his fate, to his endless war in service of masters he would have died to destroy, to his silent resistance against the corruption that has claimed him. His story is over, in all the ways that matter, but somewhere in the depths of that corrupted dreadnought, in a corner of consciousness that the way cannot quite reach, the Storm Warden still stands vigil. Even in death, he still serves. Even in corruption, he still resists. Even in darkness, he still remembers the light. This is the truth of the 42nd Millennium. This is the reality that the Imperium's warriors face every day. This is what happens when time and circumstance and the indifference of the universe conspire to break even the strongest souls. But it is also a reminder of why the fight continues, why the Imperium endures, despite all the horrors arrayed against it. Because even when individuals fall, even when entire armies are consumed, even when whole worlds burn, there are always more warriors ready to take up the burden. There are always more heroes willing to sacrifice everything for a cause they believe in. The war goes on. It has gone on for 10,000 years. It will go on for 10,000 more. And in that war, stories like Thalric's are written every day. Tragedies enacted on battlefields across the galaxy. Sacrifices made that will never be remembered by anyone who knew the people involved. But they matter nonetheless. Each life spent in the Emperor's service, each moment of courage in the face of impossible odds, each act of defiance against the darkness, they all matter. They are the foundation upon which the Imperium is built, the reason why humanity still exists in a galaxy that wants nothing more than to see it extinguished. So remember, Brother Captain Thalric. Remember what he was, what he became, what he still resists. Remember that somewhere out there, a dreadnought that should be fighting for the Emperor instead serves the Orks. Remember that 7,000 years of loyal service can be undone in a moment of catastrophic misfortune. And remember that even so, even knowing the risks and the costs and the terrible fates that might await, there are still warriors willing to step forward, to take up arms, to defend humanity against all who would see it destroyed. They do so knowing they might be forgotten. They do so knowing they might face fates worse than death. They do so because it is their duty, because it is right, because someone must. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but there is also duty and honor and the stubborn refusal to surrender even when all hope is lost. These are the things that define humanity in the 42nd millennium. These are the things that allow the Imperium to endure. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the tragedy of Brother Captain Thalric and the horror of what happens when Orks find a Dreadnought that has been asleep for 7,000 years, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are countless more stories like this waiting to be told, countless more tragedies and triumphs from across the galaxy, countless more reasons to remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, even the smallest light matters. Thank you for listening, and may the Emperor protect you.